It's my pleasure to introduce Mason Porter, who today will be speaking on topological data analysis of spatial complex systems. Thanks so much, Mason.
All right, thanks, Henry, for inviting me. I really appreciate it. So I come from, my training is in nonlinear systems and then kind of networks and complex systems and so on. And so I've been gradually learning some topological things, and I'm very much an amateur, so apologies for that. So I don't have the training that most of you have, but my students are teaching me quite a bit, and I've been very lucky to have some amazing students, and I'm going to talk about some of the work that, in particular, one former student and one current student have done. Okay, so first I'm going to give a brief advertisement. And I think this is going to make the mailing lists soon, or maybe it may have actually been on some of them yesterday. And this is a workshop on TDA to big data. I don't like the term big data, but we kind of inherit it from the conference because it's the IEEE Big Data Conference. So think of it as combinations of TDA and machine learning and various things like that that are going to show up. And doing this with some of my co-organizers, so Tegan Emerson, Sarah Tomachko, and Vlodek Zadrozny. And you can take a look at these websites, and I guess I can always share the slides or whatnot, so you don't have to copy websites right now and stuff. But please consider submitting something to this. Okay, so let's turn the page, figuratively. I want to talk about spatial systems. So we're going to be thinking, we're in low numbers of dimensions, and so we're going to be inside low dimensions, and that's going to constrain what can happen, but a rich variety of things can still happen. And it has a big influence on structure, right? So if you see a complicated system in space, some of the influence on the structure is going to come from the fact that, say, in 2 dimensions or in 3 dimensions or whatnot, there'll be some influence from other things as well, like actual physics or biology or social systems, but there are things that are going to influence it. A useful reference, and I think that a lot of places you can actually download this through Springer Link for free. It's an expensive book, so I hope you can. This is by Mark Bartholomew, called Morphogenesis of Spatial Networks. One example on which various other people have applied TDA to these sorts of examples are these quasi 2D granular materials where you've got these complicated forces, this bright stuff, these are photorefractive disks, and you've got the brightness means more forces, and the idea is to try to measure these structures. So people have actually used TDA for that. You can have spread of diseases which go through space. We all know this way too well at this point. You can have things like a rabbit warren or a metro station or city streets or fungi or the brain. So there's lots of different ones, and you can see that these things are very different from each other, even if they're constrained in a small dimensional space. So here is just pictorially related to one of the examples I showed on the last slide. Mark Fricker, who's at University of Oxford, and various collaborators have done this, have looked at this. There's also people who've taken some data of this, actually data that was released as part of a paper I wrote jointly with Mark and others, and have used topological methods on those. That's I can look up the paper if you need. It's not work by me, but people have used topological methods for this particular type of data. Another one, and this again, I've picked another one where people have used topological methods, and this is from Eleni Kadafori and company. I think she's one of the co-authors and the ones who did this on the fungal networks as well. And she's looked at leaf venation patterns, right? So you can see here, you've got various different scales, and you've got different nutrients that are going through these vessels. I will talk about this example today because this example is way too fun to not talk about, and that is spiders while spinning webs while under the influence of various psychotropic substances. And I should point out, this is caffeine spider. Cheers. And then sleeping pills and caffeine seem to be the worst offenders here. Okay, I love this example. And this example, although I won't actually do this particular example today, is related to an example that we'll now do. There's now a new paper on arXiv that we posted last night. And this is the border between Belgium and the Netherlands. In one country, it's called Barle-Nassau, and I'm sure I'm horribly butchering the name. And in another country, it's called Barle-Hertog. And everything that is in sort of yellow is Belgium, and everything that is beige is the Netherlands. And there's all sorts of funky stuff is going on here. So you've got internal regions and you've got external regions, and you've got this may be a sharp point and this may be a sharp point. And this happens in the US as well, although I don't know an example that's this crazy. But the paper that came out that we put on arXiv last night, there were a lot of edge cases that we had to deal, or that my student had to deal with, because of things like this and trying to count neighbors of different regions and stuff. Okay, so anyway, this is a topologist's dream or nightmare. Lovecraft country for topologists, I suppose. Okay, so let's switch to the stuff that's in papers that we actually did, but I hope that gives an idea of some of the types of problems that we're thinking about. And then the question is, taking a topological lens or a TDA lens, what can we say about problems of that sort? And the first one I'll talk about is to do this with two-dimensional voting data. And the paper officially came out in 2021, but it was actually on arXiv 2 years before then. And this is from my former student, Michelle Fung, who is now a postdoc at Caltech and will be on the faculty market, not this cycle, but next year's cycle. So this is someone to look out for. And then this particular paper won one of the SIAM student paper prizes this year. So it is officially, for Michelle, an award-winning paper, as it were. Anyway, you can take a look at it, and I will discuss some parts of it. Okay, and the basic idea behind this is that we want to quantify what we call political islands. So you see, like, you talk about something like Atlanta being an island of blue in a sea of red, but maybe we can actually quantify it. And that was the sort of basic idea. You can go a little further than that. You can quantify islands of light blue in a sea of dark blue. So you can have relatively fewer Democratic voters, not just Democrats versus Republicans. And the question is, how might we do this, right? So, humans are good at doing this, but you notice a lot of these precincts, right? So this is in Alameda and this is Tulare. A lot of these precincts are of weird shapes and they have different sizes, and you don't want to just pick up the size of the precincts. And if you do a standard type of simplicial complex like a Vietoris Rips, you will end up in large part picking up the size of the region. That's not what you're actually trying to pick up. So then the question is, how should you define one of these constructions to pick up what you actually want to pick up? Okay, so this voting data was compiled in the aftermath of the 2016 electoral apocalypse by the Los Angeles Times. Sorry, deadpan's one of my specialties, by the way. From the Los Angeles Times, they made this voting data public, and there's a lot of rich data, and not just for the presidential election, but for a bunch of other stuff as well. So this is, if you're interested in these sorts of problems, you may want to take a look at that data. It's precinct level, and that makes it different from a lot of voting data that's often been made public. And so it's much more finely grained in space. And so, can we identify geographical or temporal voting patterns? In this case, since it's from one election, it would be geographical. Can we somehow, in some automated way, detect outliers? And in this case, it's 2 dimensions, right? So we're restricted now to 2 dimensions. We're not going to have things like the curvature of the Earth making it 3D. You don't need that for voting. Okay, so we want to find, holes if we have nice enough space to search for those holes, and also do that with respect to like a global structure. So again, it's going to be political islands. So we can see this picture on the right, and the question is, what, maybe this is a dark blue island, maybe this is a dark blue island, and so on. And so we're going to think about these as holes in a manifold in which all precincts vote similarly. And maybe we can also say something about the structure of a county. So we do this county by county in California. Sorry, I think I said it was, or at least wrote that it was California data only. Okay, there. All right, so just to remind you, a couple of types of summaries that are going to show up in this talk. For the voting data, we're going to show barcodes. And so this is to visualize pH. And on the left, something got born, although I have to tell you what we're going to be actually moving from left to right. I haven't done that yet. And the right, something will die. And then visually, of course, longer features are more persistent, but we want to be a little bit careful about long is good and short is bad, because that's fine as long as you define your construction in a way that's respectful to your problem. If you just use a canned construction, and there are a lot of papers, especially on the applied side of this work, that do this, if you just use a canned construction, it may not be the case that long is good and short is bad. And so that's one of the messages that I want to give. That depending on, if you're going to use these ideas to study a problem, use what you know about the problem to help define your construction in the first place, so that you can then go back to an intuition that you're familiar with. And there's a few more papers that are out there now than when our preprint with this first came out. I think there's one on the theoretical side from Peter Bubenik and company. This is either from earlier this year or from last year that does some stuff about this as well. Okay, the other summary that will show up at a certain point is persistence diagrams. Apologies for the blurriness on the screen capture of those. And so now we're going to have a birth axis and a death axis, where the diagonal line would mean it's born and dies at the same time. And so now having a long life would mean you're higher above the diagonal identity line. And then we have plots, at least a couple of the plots have pink ones as the connected components as H naught, and blue ones as the 1D holes. And okay, you cannot tell from this picture, but the pink ones are actually circles and the blue ones are actually squares. We'll have a different version of this visualization for one of the projects for a certain reason, but we have some plots where we show H naught and H1 at the same time. Okay, so some standard distance-based constructions, and I won't go through the definitions because I think I'm mostly here in an audience of experts, but just to remind you, they are distance-based, and that's going to be something that for a couple of these projects we need to move a little bit away from. This is the Viator thrips and the alpha complexes. The reason that we use both in the paper is that the number of simplices in some of the counties in Los Angeles got sufficiently large that we needed to use alpha complexes for reasons of computational time. And so depending on the sizes involved, both of those got used, and you can look at the paper from Michelle and me to see which ones used which. And then these are written down, but since those are sort of standard, I'm not going to go through them, and because of time. Okay, so this is an example of, this is an alpha complex that's constructed using red precincts only. We tend to use blue and red separately. We have a set of examples where we use all blue and a set of examples we use all red. Blue means more than 50% voted for Hillary Clinton, and red means more than 50% voted for Donald Trump. It is perhaps a feature that this red, at least to my eyes, looks a little bit orange, but anyway, that was not intentional. Okay, so this is an alpha complex constructed from the red precincts of Tulare, and if you look at this, it's not really picking up what our eyes see as islands. I mean, it's picking up some stuff, but it's really not doing the job we want it to do, right? Like, it's not picking up this, for instance, although that's a dark blue island and light blue. You're kind of getting something here, getting part of one there. So it's not completely failing, but it's not really doing what we want it to do. Okay, so just a bit of a summary, again, I guess to help set this, a summary of things I made really short. The distance-based constructions are the ones that are in the software. I mean, you know, if you're someone like me who is coming from the applied side of things, one might want to do that, but then again, it depends on the problem you're looking at. So, you know, they're fast. Fast tends to be a relative term in many cases, built into packages. They're easy to interpret. People are used to them. It's based on intuition. People know which parameter values are appropriate. I don't know. Of course, there's long is good and short is bad. Doesn't always measure what we want. It's definitely not measuring what we wanted to on that example. Sensitive to rescaling. If I take a county and I zoom and make it larger, make everything larger, but the relative size is the same, it may change the answer if we do it this way. That bothers me. Okay, so we did two new constructions in this paper. The first one was the one that we actually originally thought would work better, although it still gives some stuff. And the second one is the one that ultimately works better, but we present both in the paper because they're various ways of, they're both interesting and they can be used for other things too as well. And the first one, the adjacency construction, does give some useful things. So it's not that one is always better. So we're going to use a notion of network adjacency to define simplicities. And so if n plus 1 nodes, each precinct is a node, are all pairwise adjacent, that's going to give us an n simplex. And we need to have data either on the nodes, again, on the precincts, or on the edges, so the parts in between the precincts. And we're going to use this data, so we're going to have an ordering, have some set of values that we're going to use to construct that filtration. So it's not determined by distance. And so, for instance, we could keep every precinct that voted at least 95% for Clinton and construct a simplicial complex. Or sorry, construct the simplex. Or we can keep, construct a simplicial complex. Or we could keep at least 90% and then construct that. Or we could keep at least 85% and construct that. And these are nested with each other. And so we get our filtered simplicial complex by being looser about which ones we keep when we do the construction. And so what I showed on this axis is exactly that. Keep at least 95% that voted for one candidate. Keep at least 82.5%, you can't read the number, that voted for at least one candidate, and so on. Oops, let's get to where we actually are. Okay, so the filtration is the strength of preference for a given candidate. Okay, so it does not depend on distance. It can be helpful for networks that it's either not easy or not natural to put in Euclidean space because it's really just caring about connectivity. It does want the data to be discrete. It's going to be sensitive to the choice of underlying network. So one of the technical points that we dealt with, it wasn't that big a deal for this paper, but you can imagine situations where it would be, what are called queen adjacencies versus rook adjacencies. These are terminologies from geospatial, which is a literature that we needed to get into for this. How to anger geographers. We have the tradition of mathematicians angering biologists because of things we do, and now with our work, we're angering geographers as well. We don't include nuances that the experts in the field want us to include because we want to be able to, we turn polygons into triangles. Geographers don't like that. Anyway, so, and then the nodes or edges have to have some sort of data to construct a meaningful filtration, but you have a choice as to what the data is, and hopefully that's related to the problem you're studying. Okay, the other one we did, and this was the one that ultimately we like better. Again, it's not that everything has advantages over the other, so it's not like you should always do this. And we're at UCLA, and we have Stan Osher down the hall, Mr. Level Set, and so let's do something based on level sets. This is a method for front propagation. So you could imagine one way to generalize this would use other PDEs for front propagation, right? And that's not something we've done, but that would be a cool way of doing this because maybe there's other ways of propagation that are more appropriate for certain problems. So I hope that people will build on that. So now we're thinking of data in a surface form. So we're going to start with manifold, and we're going to take a map of all the precincts with similar voting patterns. So what this means is that we have some tolerance, and we say, okay, these two dots had a similar preference for Trump, right? Maybe one was 55% and one was 54.5% or something. I don't remember the, whatever granularity we did, but the point is we start with both of these as an initial condition, and then we evolve the surface outward through the forces using this particular equation, and then the generalization for front propagation, if one wanted to use others, would be to use a different equation here. And then we take filled grid cells to be two simplices, we take grid lines to be edges and points to be vertices, and the filtration parameter is now evolution time. So we evolve time until everything fills. Okay, it's a very fast method for front propagation. People have been studying this for 30 years. So this is a thickening of a point cloud. It's VR-like, but we're starting with a manifold rather than starting with points, right? So we're thickening it in a different way, but it has that kind of intuition. It's just that we're starting with a different type of thing. And so a persistence will then correspond to the size of a feature, and larger holes will take longer to fill. Okay, so we can use the underlying shape of a map, which the adjacency complex cannot do. We maintain some notion of the size of the holes via the mesh size. And if you do large data sets, it's actually, I mean, again, relatively speaking, pretty fast. Okay, bad stuff. Difficult to associate the generators of holes with the original precincts on the maps. Okay, that's right, generators are a problem. If your data is less granular, it may not be so great. There are geographic features that it thinks are features that are not actually features in terms of what we want to study, like a body of water will confuse it, right? So if you know the body of water is there, you can say, I'm going to cut out the body of water and say it's not part of my problem, but otherwise it's going to take the body of water as one of these features, and well, you know, that's not where people are voting. Okay, and just to show you what these complexes look like, or can look like, and this is for Tulare County. Tulare County alpha I showed you earlier, and it has this particular barcode. The adjacency one looks like this. It goes from 95 to -5. -5 means it really means that it still exists at zero preference, because you cannot have negative votes, although who knows, it's 2021, all sorts of weird stuff happens now. And then the level set one, which visually on this example seems to be doing the best at what our eyes would look at islands. I mean, humans are good at this, right? Computers are bad at this, humans are good at this, does this. And the ones that are relative to the level set tend to be the ones that start at the beginning. Okay, so here's a key point from the paper. We can distinguish short persistence features that occur only for a narrow range of distance scales from short persistence noise, because what we did is that we did the construction in a way that we can go back to the long is good, short is bad intuition, right? So the intuition's fine as long as you construct something that's respectful to your problem. But it's not just fine if you just do something just because it's in, you know, a software package. Okay, so we applied this to other data as well, these ideas. This paper is 2020 and the other is 2021, but math travels at a slower slower rate than physics. And so this paper is actually the second paper, even though it was published first. And that just happens. And this is also from Michelle Fung and me. Okay. Got to do this example. So there's a few examples in the paper, but the basic idea was we spent a bunch of time thinking about things. Let's just do a bunch of examples and write an accessible paper for physicists that has a number of examples. So in the mid-90s, NASA had some sort of, you know, the Marshall Space Flight Center sent some people into space. They gave drugs to spiders and they measured their webs, trying to find Spider-Man. But actually, there's earlier work from Peter Witt, who spent half a century studying spiders in all sorts of forms. And Peter Witt's buddy was having trouble sleeping and asked Peter, can you do something about it? These spiders are spinning webs at 2 in the morning and I can't sleep. Can you do something? So he gave them a bunch of drugs and measured I don't know why this would help with the noise from spider webs. I don't get that, but, and tried to see what happened. And the basic conclusion was that more toxic chemicals resulted in more deformed webs. And so what we decided as a sort of fun example to include as one of the examples in this paper was just to use the level set complex to just, you know, see what this looked like with the persistent homology of these spider webs. And then to do, this is why we actually used persistence diagrams, to then do a clustering method on the persistence diagrams to see if we could do some classification. So again, here's caffeine spider. I will be spinning some strange webs tonight, I suppose. Okay, and this is what we get. Remember, the pink circles are connected components, and the blue circles are the 1D holes. And we get a bunch of diagrams that, okay, we've got visuals, but then we do single or average linkage clustering on H1 only. Okay, and then that will give us this. So we've got the drug-free spider on its own, and we've got marijuana, peyote, and LSD over here, and we've got chloral hydrates and sleeping pills, speed and caffeine over here. Okay, once again. There's some more detail there. Of course, doing a clustering with 7 things is not typically the type of application you think it's meaningful to do clustering type methods. So we also do more serious ones, such as street networks in a couple hundred cities. And then you get clusters that you have grid-like ones, and you have interrupted grids, and you have ones that are not grid-like. Unsurprisingly, you get more grid and interrupted grids in the US because we have more cities that are like that. And you get more complicated behavior or more complicated structures in other parts of the world. One thing that our paper has is a comparison of our classification to ones that other people did in different ways. So this is a bit more of a serious application where you could ask, well, does the topological structure of, say, a center 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer region of different cities, if you do it in different ways, what do you pick up? So it's a bit more of a serious application that one could try different ways and build on. I think I'm not going to be showing the actually, I don't think I have the dendrogram ready, but anyway, just to give you some intuition. Okay, LA, it's pretty boring. This is LA. This is or 1 kilometer by LA. The 2 different sub communities in the interrupted grid. So this is Aleppo and this is Barcelona. This should be a big body of water. Remember, our method gets confused by bodies of water. And then the ones that are not grid-like, this is Nanyang, where not much is happening. I think Nanyang is in a cluster which only has 2 things. There were just a couple ones that didn't have much happening. And then this is London. Again, it's a 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer point. There is a rich data set of city streets by Jeff Boeing, who is a geographer at USC. And so if any of you are interested in that example, there's quite an easy source of data to look at those. You can also do it within cities. So for instance, you can do this in Shanghai and sample 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer parts from different things in Shanghai. And you can find kind of areas that have some resemblance to things that were built in different times. The reason Shanghai is an interesting example is that different parts of the city were constructed in very different eras, and the structure of the streets and other things in it reflects that. Okay, now we're going to really turn the page. This was put on archive last night, and then of course we consulted with Henry among others in early parts of this. So this is finally finished. Well, finished. We'll see what the referees say. But this project started a year ago, or a little more than a year ago. And in fact, the original part of this project was my colleague Deanna Needell asking a question at Michelle Fung's PhD thesis defense in April 2020. So there is some use to PhD thesis defenses. Occasionally someone asks a question and eventually a year and a quarter later, it turns into a paper. This does sometimes happen. The first author here is Abby Hickok, who is going to start her 4th year in the PhD program this coming fall. She will be looking for a postdoc, again, not the current cycle, but a cycle 1 year from now. So depending on whether you're hiring for faculty or hiring for postdocs, I've got 2 very, very smart, talented, wonderful people who I hope that some of you will take a look at and hire. And this is to look at now not just geospatial, but spatiotemporal. People argue apparently about where to put the hyphen on that if you Google it, data. And we're going to look at anomalies using persistent homology and as case studies, because that's the cool thing to do. We're going to do it with COVID-19 data. Intuitively, you can think of anomalies kind of like hotspots. We avoided the word, and we actually have a book chapter that we haven't done page proofs of yet that we're going to need to change the word of that during page proofs. So hotspots gives the intuition, but the CDC defines hotspots based on absolute numbers, and we want relative numbers. We want local min and local max. And when it comes to COVID studies, I get very nervous about, I don't want people to think that we're actually doing what the CDC says, but hotspots is an intuition that you can think about, but anomalies is a more correct term. Okay, there's two data sets here. The first one is one that we got from a website, so you'll be able to get easily. The second one is a little bit more difficult because we actually got it directly from the LA County Department of Public Health. Although, I mean, privately, I can show you what some of the data looks like potentially, but the first one is per capita vaccination rates in different zip codes of New York City. So now we're thinking of, Barrow-Nassau, right? Remember that thing I showed you with different neighborhoods? We're going to have to actually find a way to count neighbors properly, which is going to be annoying when you've got zip codes that are shaped topologically like figure eights, which does happen. That is not hypothetical. That does happen. There's a picture of that in the paper. Fully vaccinated people on one particular day. We don't have daily data for this one, so we did this one on one day. It will use a different construction. Things like bodies of water being annoying, we want a construction that does not have that problem. So that's one of the problems that we fix here. We won't get things like measuring the size of islands. So that's what we'll lose. So we'll lose a little bit from before, but we'll get some other stuff that the previous work couldn't do. Fully vaccinated in this context is slightly different from how others use the term. Or how colloquially we use the term. Here, fully vaccinated means I have had all the doses I need to have. It does not mean 2 weeks after, okay? Which is different from how we colloquially use the term. This is the definition that's on their website, therefore that's what they use because those are the numbers that they were measuring. We also used case rates, per capita case rates in neighborhoods in the city of Los Angeles. These are running 14-day mean per capita case rates. The 14-day mean smooths it out, and I'm expecting that 14 days was something that they chose because people report 14-day running case rates. That's a very common choice. I believe 14 days comes from the natural timescales of COVID. I think that that's where that choice comes from. And this is 1 year, or 1 year and 1 day, technically, that we do that for. So this is when we're going to have stuff moving through time, and there are different ways that one could do it. And this came from a suggestion from Henry, so thank you so much for that. We ended up using vineyards, but another possibility would be to use multi-parameter persistence of various types. And we have a brief discussion of that, and also of multi-parameter zigzag as a possibility in an appendix. So there are other choices that one could have made. Okay, so how do we construct a simplicial complex? And I'm going to do this one faster than before, so I'm not going to give you the full details, but basically you do one for each region. LA is in regions that are defined by LA County. We use regions that they gave us. We use populations that they provided. And then New York is zip code. So we have something like this. And if I look at Porter Ranch, it has 2 neighbors. It has Granada Hills as a neighbor. It has Northridge as a neighbor. And this is probably on the edge of LA, so I probably have to worry about exterior as a neighbor. And you have to count in a certain way. So you could, for example, go clockwise. I don't remember if that's what we do, but you have to make some choice and be consistent. And if you start having holes and corners and things like that, then you have to make sure that you count neighbors correctly and compensate the right way. And that's where some of the technical work comes in. So we construct one for each region where we need to deal with its neighbors. And then we glue their boundaries together in a way that will respect the geographical region boundaries. So this is our simplicial complex in this case. It looks like this. So there's a green and blue needed to get counted 3 times and so on. So you have to look in the paper for the details of this, but you get things that look along these lines. So here's a more complicated example. So this is Koreatown and its neighbors. So we have Koreatown, we picked all of its neighbors. Notice that Wilshire Center is a neighbor in 2 spots. And you have to zoom in here. If you zoom in here, you actually see that this is not a corner, although there are corners. And so we have to make sure we count it. So we end up getting this object. Again, I don't think we have Burl and Nassau, right? Just imagine doing this with Burl and Nassau and neighbors, right? But this does give a procedure for how to do it. I just don't think we have an example that's that bad. This is not the worst example, or sorry, worse. This is not the most complicated example. I don't know if topologists like complicated examples or don't like it, right? Some people are excited by having to deal with. But anyway, the sort of technical work on the simplicial complex comes with dealing with these various corner cases that occur. Okay, and then we need a filtration function. There's actually 4 different ones that we use, because you have to also worry about disconnected components and how you want to count things and so on. And so this is one of the filtration functions we use. This is a sub-level filtration. So we're going to be finding local anomalies that are higher, relatively higher, either vaccination rates or running case rates. And so here we have so we have these sub-level sets, and we have 2 well-separated local maxima. And so we look at this function, we need a real valued function. This happens to be either per capita vaccination rate or per capita case rate, or you have an example that's less well separated. And so your filtration parameter is going from A to E, or also going from F to J. And so if you do a sub-level filtration this way, you will find local maxima. If you do a super level filtration this way, you will find local minima, right? Vaccination rates, you might actually want to find local minima. And then there's an alternate version which is because sometimes you have disconnected components. So there's actually 4 variants, and I'm just showing one just because of time and so on. Okay. This is vaccination rates in New York City. Each point is a zip code, which is labeled by borough. So there's a number of different zip codes in Manhattan, and there's a number of different zip codes in Queens and so on. And here that has a higher vaccination rate than its neighboring zip codes. Sorry, this one is higher. So it's using one of the sub-level types. I think it was using the type from the last. Yes, it was using the type from the last slide. I made the 2 slides consistent with each other. That's good. I always do that. So, you know, the Bronx has a zip code that's doing pretty well. And okay, it's a little bit harder to interpret what things mean on this thing in terms of, can we come up with things like interventions and so on, right? Because we're doing data analysis. But then the LA one that's interesting is that imagine we wanted to do something over time, and we can ask, well, are there certain things that if we only look at the early times last a while and then change later? So it's retrospective, but one could imagine doing that with data that's streaming that you don't have in yet. Okay, I'm being way too fast to appreciate it, but hopefully at least you get some idea. This is the, well, okay, the version in the final paper is a little bit different from this one because we needed to get down to 30 pages to submit to the journal to make sure we get refereed. So this particular legend got put into a supplemental information. Anyway, we use vineyards to examine birth and death features over time. Since vineyards are maybe used a little bit less commonly, think of this as a continuous stack of persistence diagrams. The length through time is going to be how long one of these things lasts. You can measure the length of a vine, the amount of time it's there. And so they're going to trace out these curves through time. So it looks like this. This picture is adapted from something from reference 22, which I think is the original vineyard paper, if I remember correctly. But we have something like this. And the colors, notice the colors change. The colors are based on the most prominent region through time. I know you can't see so much with those plots, but hopefully you at least get some idea of what's going on there. So we've got the birth and we've got the death, and the vineyards are going through time from April 25th, 2020 to April 25th, 2021. And early ones can be different than later ones. This is the same, these two are the same one, it's just we're showing it at a different angle. So here is highlighted regions that had local maxima, right? Different local maxima of case rates as a function of time. These are showing it for some subset of time. So maybe what you'd really want is a video of this saying, well, here are the local maxima as they run through time. And I don't know if these are ones that have been highlighted now and and so on. But these are some that showed up as local maxima. Okay, so rapid fire a bit, and actually mostly on time. Okay, so we looked at persistent homology in spatial and spatiotemporal data. So really looking at also geospatial data sets. And when you have data that's in fewer dimensions, and this was actually one of the ways that the voting project started, that was, by the way, yet another warm-up PhD problem that turned into almost a whole PhD thesis, which I know is a very common thing, because there was just stuff that was harder than we thought it would be. But if you have fewer dimensions, there's less stuff that can happen, and you can have a bit more of a systematic comparison of what different constructions will do. And so in this SIAM review paper, we took a couple of the usual constructions, and then we compared it to constructions that were particularly useful for our data, and develop those novel constructions as part of what we were trying to do. And then just as a reminder, I feel like this reminder is probably more needed on the applied side, because I think people who go about it mathematically tend to be having this in mind. It's just that I see a lot of papers that use, there's a lot of available software, and they say, oh, it's long, it's good, it's short, it's bad. I've had referees criticize my work because, oh, why are you saying that these shorter features are good? Because they're shorter. And I'm like, but we thought about the problem we were working on. So short persistence features versus short persistence noise, and thinking carefully about how we construct a complex for the system that you're studying is something that I think is super important. And it's not going to be equally easy for every example, right? Like, we know that in the brain, things are also in space, but I don't know how to take space into account in the right way for the brain. Whereas political islands, we have intuition for ourselves, where we can really use that intuition to help how we think about the problem. And that's all I have on the slides.
Fantastic. So briefly, before we get to questions, let's unmute ourselves and applaud for Mason. All right. So what questions are there for the speaker? Renata, I see you have your hand up. Please go ahead.
Yes. Hello, Mason, and hello, everyone. Thanks for a super interesting talk. I had my eye on this paper on the voting patterns by Michelle and you for quite a while, and I had it even open at some time and wanted to read it, but didn't find the time. So it was really useful to get a brief summary today. I find it really interesting, and I really appreciate how you talk about the importance of the choice of filtration. And in particular, I found this, what you call adjacency construction, really interesting. You mentioned there how you define the filtration value on the edges, on the areas.
Well, yeah, we did it on the node. For this paper, we did it on the nodes. For the physics paper where we did some examples, that one included examples that had things on the edges. But for this first paper, we actually only actually have an example with it on the nodes.
Yeah, indeed. So I'm talking now about the voting patterns paper. So there, it was very clear how you define the filtration value on the nodes, indeed. But still, to build the simplicial complexes, you need to know what is the filtration value on an edge between two nodes.
So what we do is that given the node data, that determines what nodes we keep in practice. So for example, if I say that I'm going to keep all precincts, so I can't take one county and it has a bunch of precincts. Maybe it has, I don't know, 100 precincts, whatever it has. And I keep every single precinct that, say, voted at least 95% for Clinton. Mm-hmm. And then those are now the nodes that I keep right now at my current level. And if I use adjacencies from those nodes only, so it's from that subset, mm-hmm. And then I construct a simplex. And then I go to say 90%. I think we did it by 5, but one could, of course, change the granularity. Say, okay, there's each one that has 90. And so now there's a larger number of the nodes that are present. And then I construct the edges that way. Right. So the idea is that the value is determining which nodes are present, and then I construct the edges based on the adjacency properties of those of the subset of nodes that are present.
Yeah, and how is this adjacency calculated then between two nodes that are present? How do we calculate that?
So I look if they're adjacent on a map. You can use either queen adjacency or rook adjacency. So rook adjacency, okay, queen adjacency allows corners, rook adjacency does not allow corners. Okay. I think we used queen adjacency, but I would need to look that up. So that's a choice that one has to make.
Okay, yeah. So it's just 0, 1, then you don't take.
Yeah, that's just, yeah, we just do 0, 1. So yeah. Queen adjacency and rook adjacency that's terminology actually from geospatial systems. The intuition is that queen adjacency means you can walk from one to the other without going anywhere in between, and rook adjacency requires some non-zero length that's next to each other. Mm-hmm. So the fact that so queen and rook are intuitions, but not exactly like in chess.
Yeah. I was just wondering, indeed, what is the filtration value defined on an edge? I mean, this is.
Yeah, no, we just get 0, 1 from there.
Yeah, so geographical information, indeed. And
yeah.
Then the second question related to the same paper is, you mentioned then these 4 different filtrations that you use, but how do you evaluate them? How do you compare them? What is
it's a different paper that had 4 different filtrations.
I didn't have strips, alpha, adjacency. And
I'm sorry. Okay, no, I got it. Okay, now I understand what you're saying. Right. So what we do, and I did not show you, I did not show you how we evaluate it, right? So I showed you a comparison visually. What we do is that we look at how many features they got correct. And so this was something we actually ended up doing this by eye manually, where we say, okay, this found 5 features and 4 of them are actual islands. So there's a big table in the paper that I don't show here at all that has all of those side by side. Alpha and Vietoris rips are not actually compared to each other. We use Vietoris rips if we can handle it computationally, and we use alpha if we can't. So it's really comparing distance-based to the others. Yeah, so there's a big table where we do that. And the other comparison that's in the paper has to do with how long the calculations take as well. Because sometimes you can also be clever and find a way for it to take less time, because the simplicial complexes will scale in different ways. The number of simplices will scale in different ways for these different constructions. But yeah, so that's in the paper, but I did not actually show that in these slides.
Yeah, but then the one that is the best with respect to the first performance criteria, so the number of features that I guess correctly is the level set, adjacency? The level set,
yeah, the level set usually did the best. Mm-hmm. Our initial intuition was that adjacency would do the best. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's not uniformly better, right? I mean, but that's the one that ended up doing the best.
Yeah, maybe it would be interesting indeed to try to define the value of the filtration on the edges in some also different ways.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. Oh, I am really hoping that there's a lot of stuff one can do.
Yeah.
I know there's and the code is public, and so you can play with it and adjust. Oh yeah. There's no way to think that this is the last story on any of this. It's just, we're really trying to say, use information from the problem you're studying when you can. This is an example problem where it's possible. And the fact that it's, there's all this intuition that the geographers have developed. So, okay, they're yelling at us, but I do actually have a project with a geographer. I mean, it's, turning polygons into triangles. They're like, we had perfectly good polygons. No, there's a ton of stuff one can do, and this is only the beginning of the story. And so I really hope that that people will improve various things where we took shortcuts and so on.
Awesome, thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Further questions? Jennifer, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I have a question. It's not exactly directly about one of your recent papers, but I've been thinking about social contact networks. We've been generating social contact networks of rural communities, considering COVID-19 transmission on them. And anyway, so I've really just learned about this area in the course of that work. And I'm trying to think about how to consider the distance between two networks. And I'd like to do that by comparing the distance between persistence diagrams.
Okay.
But I'm concerned that the bottleneck distance might not capture all of the features I'm interested in, because I've seen, it seems to me that so the way we've defined our distances, and if this is more information than you want to have happen in this seminar, I don't want to.
No, it's fine. Go. It's fine.
Okay. So we consider the reciprocal of the contacts as the distance between two nodes, and the nodes are individuals, synthetic communities, and then we have the torus rich complex built off of that distance. So when you see things sort of fill in, right, there's this period where you get a lot of H1s sort of filling in, right, just circles closing, and then you get a period where there's a lot of H2s along the diagonal of a persistence diagram. And I've noticed that when we implement interventions in our simulations that result in significantly reduced transmission, where you actually get a reduction in the total disease burden, not just a distribution of it by flattening a curve, that you get sort of a separation of those densities of filling in, right? So the H0s kind of fill in, or sorry, the H1 nodes along the diagonal fill in first, and then you get your H2 nodes sort of filling in after, right? So they sort of separate these little, they look like densities to me. I don't know how else to think about it. And I'd like to have a distance between my persistence diagrams that would keep both the information about the persistent features as well as that sort of, I mean, I almost think of it as a connectivity thing, like at what distance are you moving from sort of a flat, like thinking of this network in a flat way, to thinking up to like having it gum up because you've got the distances too short, right? Does that make sense?
I think I have some intuition for what you said. I don't think I have a complete understanding, because I think that, I mean, this would require a longer discussion probably for that.
I think it would, especially because my vocabulary is limited. I'm not a topologist.
Oh, I'm not a topologist either, so you know.
I don't know.
Of course, my students properly know it. They teach me, which is the best thing ever, by the way. But you're talking about one network, because at first when you were talking about it, I thought you were comparing multiple networks.
I'm talking about multiple networks. So I have a simulation that I can set the household structure, which gives sort of some underlying connectivity structure, and then I run the simulation to get contact. You know, there's dice that roll. Right. So you know, and so I want to measure the distance. I want to know like what features are properties of the household structure, and what features are properties of the transmission.
So one thing that's worth mentioning is that measuring distance between networks, and there are different ways that people have done this, you know, topological and otherwise, is hard. And so I think one important thing is going to be to ask, you know, what a topological approach will pick up and what other things will pick up. The topological approaches that I am aware of, I think Nina Pfefferman has a paper where she did that, and it's just something that she called tangle. So it's really very different. It's not, I don't know about pH approaches with this, and it makes sense to try it. In terms of the different distances, I believe, and I don't know the authors of these papers, or I don't remember who the authors of these papers are. I believe there are a number of papers that are specifically about trying to find richer ways of calculating distances between different persistence diagrams. And it sounds like that thread of literature is one that you're going to want to look at for your particular problem, because you're talking about your choice not being maybe good enough. And I don't know the details of what these papers have done, but I know there are a number of papers that have tried to do this. And from a technical point of view, I think that may be a series of things for you to look at.
Well, there's a tropical embedding that was by like Sarah Kalishnik and some other people, right? Which is how I found this, because I was looking up her work. And so, I mean, I'm using that, but she proved, right, that it's continuous with respect to the bottleneck embedding and the embedding. Is that right?
She's,
for the Wasserstein metric.
Yeah, I'll
like,
let her answer this. She's in
yeah?
the room. I'm not going to answer that.
Okay, maybe,
I've
Sarah
seen
can
the
answer for me.
paper,
But I don't know if it would be, if you would expect it to be continuous for other like distances between persistence diagrams. Like it seems like it could be, but I'm pretty ignorant about all of this stuff. So
right. When we were doing our distances between persistence diagrams for one of the papers, we were just using one of the standard programmed approaches. So we were not being sophisticated in terms of our own innovation about using distances. So Henry wrote a comment talking about Wasserstein distances to look up those instead of doing bottleneck. And Wasserstein may have been what I would have to actually look up what we did, because I know that we did H1 only on that, not doing H0. And you have both H1 and H2, so I'm pretty positive you're going to need to be more sophisticated than we were. But for distances between networks, you're probably going to also want to compare it to how other people have done things without using topology, because the number of approaches for distances between networks, just if you're not restricting yourself to a particular, say, mathematical point of view, there are a large number of possibilities. And so it's not even clear to me that for the problem you're studying, whether a topological approach will actually be best for that application. I mean, it may be. I mean, the thing that all of us do, of course, if we have hammers, everything looks like a nail. We all do this. But we should also think about whether, and I'm not.
Yeah, none of my hammers work. They're all related to like automorphic forms. So.
Oh yeah. Okay. Fair enough.
That's my prior COVID life.
Oh no. Fair enough. No, there's. I mean, I can point you to some literature that's done comparison of networks that's not topological as well, because I have one paper on that, and I've seen both in terms of forward citations and standard citations, different approaches. But like, there's so many approaches that are totally different from each other.
Well, maybe I can follow up by email.
Yeah. But I mean, you should look up the Wasserstein example for PDs as an example of that's related to your current approach, and then I'm happy to also chat further either about this approach or about other approaches.
Yeah, that'd be great. I mean, yeah, that would be fantastic. I went through to try to answer a question and ended up in like some really interesting stuff. So thanks for letting me tell you about it.
Yeah, well, that's what these are for, right? I mean, otherwise we would just watch YouTube videos and read the paper.
So maybe if it's okay with Mason, we have time for one more question.
Uh-huh.
Anyone want to be our last question asker of the day?
Sure, I have a question. I was curious, like your level set construction you have on the screen there.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I should not have changed that. Right.
Yeah. Do you think that could transfer to like image, like object detection and like images?
I think that it ought to, because I mean, so there is the level set method, you know, with this, it's for front propagation. So anything in which front propagation might be useful. And I know that, not using level set pH, or not using the level set simplicial complex from our paper, but just level set method in general has been used a lot for images in the past. And so I expect that it should, right? Because anything where you have a notion of, well, we called it political islands, but you would say just, you know, islands of one thing in a sea of something else. And, you know, if you're trying to detect, you know, one of the famous images people do is the cow images, you know, and you want to detect the cows. Yeah, one should be able to do that. We didn't try it, but I think it ought to be able to do reasonably.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so let's end at least the recording here. Thank you very much, Mason, for the fantastic talk, and thank you everybody for the inspiring questions.
Yeah, thanks everybody, and thanks for the invitation again. I really appreciate it.